A brash tourist dared to mock an ancient tradition by snatching a sacred medallion from an Imperial Palace guard, but the next 60 seconds shattered his arrogance forever. The crowd watched in stunned silence as centuries of honor faced off against modern disrespect, and justice was about to be served in the most unexpected way. In the heart of Kyoto, where ancient walls hold 1,000 years of whispered secrets, one man's disrespect was about to meet its match in a display of dignity that would leave millions speechless. On a sweltering summer morning in Kyoto, Japan, where ancient traditions dance with modern tourism, the Imperial Palace's East Garden stood as a testament to timeless dignity. The carefully manicured paths lined with centuries-old pine trees led visitors through a landscape where every stone and branch seemed to whisper tales of emperors past. Here, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Here, the Eternal Guard of the Rising Sun maintained their legendary vigilance, a tradition dating back over 5 centuries. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine gravel paths, while the gentle rustling of leaves in the ancient trees created a natural symphony that had serenaded countless generations before. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto stood motionless at his post, his presence commanding respect without uttering a word. At 45 years old, his weathered face told stories of 2 decades of unwavering service. His ceremonial uniform, a masterpiece of deep indigo silk adorned with golden threads and ancient symbols, gleamed under the morning sun. The medallion of first light, a sacred symbol passed down through generations of guards, rested prominently on his chest, its golden surface catching sunlight and reflecting it like a beacon of honor. Each scratch and mark on the medallion held a story, passed down through generations of guards who had stood this same watch since the Meiji era. The morning air was thick with humidity, yet Captain Yamamoto showed no sign of discomfort. His posture remained perfect, his breathing measured and calm. The weight of tradition rested on his shoulders as comfortably as his ceremonial armor, polished to such a shine that it reflected the passing clouds like a mirror. His eyes, sharp and alert despite their fixed gaze, had been trained through years of discipline to observe everything while appearing to look at nothing. The usual morning crowd of tourists flowed around him like water around a rock, many pausing to admire his stoic presence and take photos from a respectful distance. Japanese visitors bowed slightly as they passed, teaching their children about the significance of the guard's role. Elderly locals nodded in appreciation, remembering how their own parents had brought them to see the guards decades ago. The atmosphere was one of quiet reverence, broken only by the occasional whisper and the soft click of cameras. Young children clutched their parents' hands, pointing in wonder at the living embodiment of their history textbooks. A group of school students on a field trip listened intently as their teacher explained in hushed tones the significance of the guard's role and the sacred medallion he wore. International tourists consulted their guidebooks, reading about the centuries-old traditions they were witnessing. The morning sun continued its climb, casting ever-changing shadows across the ancient stones of the palace walls. But among the sea of respectful visitors, one figure stood out like a garish painting in a Zen garden. Brad Thompson, a 38-year-old social media influencer from Los Angeles, practically swaggered through the garden, his neon green tank top with Party Beast emblazoned across it clashing violently with the serene surroundings. His booming voice carried across the peaceful garden as he live-streamed to his followers, the gaudy gold chain around his neck swinging with each exaggerated gesture. His designer sunglasses sat perched on his artificially tanned face, despite the relative shade of the garden paths. "What's up, Beast Army? Your boy Brad is here at this super boring palace place, but we're about to make it lit." He gestured wildly with his selfie stick, his other hand clutching an energy drink, the aluminum can gleaming garishly in the morning light. A small group of younger tourists had already gathered around him, drawn to his loud presence like moths to a flame, phones ready to capture whatever spectacle he might create. Their excited whispers added an undercurrent of tension to the previously peaceful atmosphere. "Yo, check this out, they got these guys standing around like statues, probably not even real, am I right?" Brad's voice echoed off the ancient walls, causing several Japanese visitors to wince and hurry past. He approached Captain Yamamoto, his camera pointed directly at the guard's face. "Let's see if we can make this statue move. This is going to be epic, guys. Don't forget to smash that like button. We're about to hit 10,000 viewers." The crowd's energy shifted palpably. Some tourists backed away, sensing the impending breach of protocol. Others raised their phones higher, anticipating drama. A young Japanese girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering urgently about the disrespectful foreigner. The air itself seemed to grow thicker with tension as Brad stepped closer to the guard, his face twisted in an exaggerated expression of mock curiosity. An elderly Japanese man shook his head sadly, while a group of international students exchanged worried glances. Captain Yamamoto remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward, embodying centuries of discipline. The sacred medallion on his chest caught the sunlight again, sending a brilliant flash across the garden, almost like a warning signal that went unheeded by the approaching influencer. Behind his stoic expression, thousands of hours of training and meditation held him in perfect composure, even as the social media star invaded his personal space. Little did Brad know, but his next action would trigger a chain of events that would not only change his life forever, but would also become a viral lesson in respect that would echo across social media platforms worldwide. The ancient gardens of the Imperial Palace were about to witness a clash between modern arrogance and timeless honor, and only one would emerge victorious. The morning breeze carried cherry blossoms across the scene, nature itself seeming to pause in anticipation of what would happen next. Brad circled the guard like a predator sizing up its prey, his live stream viewers climbing by the hundreds. His designer shoes crunched against the ancient gravel pathway as he invaded the sacred space between tourist and tradition. The morning sun cast his shadow across Captain Yamamoto's perfectly polished boots, a physical manifestation of the disrespect that was about to unfold. "Come on, guys, let's get this stream to 20,000 viewers." Brad's voice boomed through the garden, shattering the contemplative atmosphere that had existed just moments before. "I bet none of these other tourists have ever gotten this close to one of these guys. That's why I'm the beast. I go where others won't." He flashed his trademark grin at the camera, a smile that had earned him millions in sponsorship deals and countless followers across multiple platforms. The crowd had grown larger now, forming a loose semicircle around the unfolding scene. A mix of emotions played across their faces: disappointment, curiosity, concern, and for some younger viewers who recognized Brad, excitement. A group of elderly Japanese visitors huddled together, speaking in hushed, worried tones. One of them, a distinguished-looking man in his 70s, pulled out his phone with trembling hands, apparently calling for assistance. "Hey, check out this uniform," Brad continued, his camera panning up and down Captain Yamamoto's ceremonial dress. "Pretty fancy for a guy who just stands around all day, right?" He leaned in closer, his face just inches from the guard's shoulder. The scent of his expensive cologne clashed with the natural fragrance of the garden's cherry blossoms. "What's with all these medals anyway? Probably just for show, like everything else in this place." A young Japanese student in a crisp school uniform stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Please, sir, you must show respect. These guards are very important to our heritage." Her English was precise, each word carefully chosen. But Brad barely spared her a glance, too focused on his performing for his growing online audience. "Heritage? Come on, sweetheart. This is the 21st century." Brad laughed, playing to his camera. "Nobody cares about standing around like a statue anymore. My followers want action, entertainment." He turned back to Captain Yamamoto, whose expression remained impassive despite the escalating situation. "Let's see what this guy's made of." The sacred medallion of first light continued to gleam on the guard's chest, its ancient surface catching the morning sun. Brad's eyes fixed upon it, a mischievous glint appearing in his expression. His livestream chat exploded with messages, some encouraging him to push further, others begging him to stop. The viewer count had now passed 25,000. "You know what would make this video absolutely viral?" Brad's voice took on a conspiratorial tone as he addressed his audience. "What if we found out if these medals are even real?" He reached out with his free hand, fingers extended toward the sacred medallion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The crowd collectively held its breath, several people calling out in warning. A young American tourist, recognizing the severity of what was about to happen, shouted, "Dude, don't!" "That's not cool." But his voice was lost in the growing murmur of the crowd. Two palace staff members had appeared at the edge of the gathering, their faces concerned as they assessed the situation. The atmospheric tension in the garden had reached a fever pitch. The ancient pine trees seemed to lean in, their shadows darkening as clouds temporarily obscured the morning sun. A flock of crows took flight from a nearby roof, their harsh calls echoing across the garden like a warning. Brad's fingers were now mere inches from the medallion. Captain Yamamoto remained motionless, but those close enough might have noticed a subtle change in his breathing, a slight tensing of his jaw. The discipline of decades of service was about to be tested against the brash disrespect of a social media stunt. "Time to make history, Beast Army," Brad announced, his voice carrying across the now silent garden. His followers watched through their screens as his hand moved closer to the sacred symbol, unknowingly about to cross a line that had been respected for centuries. The morning light caught the medallion one final time, sending a brilliant flash across Brad's face, nature's last warning to a man too absorbed in his own spectacle to recognize the gravity of his actions. The tension in the garden had become almost unbearable. Japanese visitors watched with hands covering their mouths while international tourists stood frozen, many recording but all sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of the crows, as if the very garden itself was holding its breath. In the next moment, Brad Thompson, self-proclaimed social media beast, was about to learn that some traditions carry consequences that no amount of followers can protect you from. His fingers reached for the medallion, and the ancient gardens of Kyoto braced for what would happen next. In one fluid motion that would soon be replayed millions of times across the internet, Brad's fingers closed around the sacred medallion of first light. The ancient metal was cool against his touch, its surface smooth from centuries of careful preservation. Without hesitation or reverence, he yanked hard, breaking the ceremonial clasp that had held it in place since the last changing of the guard ceremony. "Got it!" Brad's triumphant voice echoed through the garden as he held up his prize. "Look at this, Beast Army. Your boy just made history." He waved the medallion in front of his camera, the sacred symbol dancing carelessly in his grasp like a cheap trinket. The morning sunlight caught its surface, sending fractured reflections across the faces of the horrified onlookers. The crowd's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. A collective gasp rippled through the gathering, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to swallow even the natural sounds of the garden. The elderly Japanese man who had been making a phone call dropped his device, his weathered face a mask of shock and dismay. Several tourists instinctively stepped backward, distancing themselves from what they knew was an egregious breach of protocol. A young mother quickly covered her children's eyes, hurrying them away from the scene while whispering urgent explanations in Japanese. International tourists stood frozen, their own cameras capturing what they sensed would become a momentous incident. The school group that had been quietly observing earlier now huddled together, their teacher's face pale with disbelief. "Is this thing even real gold?" Brad examined the medallion with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over in his hands as his live stream continued. "Probably just fancy brass or something. No way they'd let real treasure just hang out here, right?" His voice carried a forced casualness, but a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the first hints of uncertainty about his actions. The livestream chat exploded with activity. Some viewers cheered on his boldness, while others expressed horror at the desecration they were witnessing. The viewer count had surged past 50,000 as news of the incident began spreading across social media platforms. Brad's face gleamed with sweat. Whether from the morning heat or growing nervousness, it wasn't clear. "Hey, maybe I should try it on." He raised the medallion toward his own neck, playing to his audience. "What do you guys think? Should your boy become an honorary guard?" His laugh echoed off the ancient walls, but it sounded hollow now, carrying an edge of forced bravado that hadn't been there before. Captain Yamamoto had not moved a muscle since the medallion was torn from his uniform. His expression remained impassive, but the air around him had changed. The morning breeze that had been gently stirring the cherry blossoms seemed to still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Those closest to the guard would later swear they could feel a palpable energy emanating from his still form, like the calm before a devastating storm. Two palace staff members who had been watching from the periphery now spoke urgently into their radios, their voices low but intense. A security camera mounted discreetly on a nearby wall pivoted silently to focus on the scene. In the distance, the sound of rapid footsteps on gravel could be heard approaching. Brad, still playing to his audience, held the medallion high above his head. "Come on, my guy, you gonna do something about this?" He waved the sacred symbol tauntingly. "Or are you just gonna stand there like a—" His words trailed off as he finally noticed something that sent a chill down his spine despite the summer heat. Captain Yamamoto's eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead throughout the entire incident, slowly shifted to meet Brad's gaze. In that moment, the social media star felt the full weight of centuries of tradition bearing down upon him. The guard's eyes held no anger, no emotion at all, just an ancient, unshakable purpose that made Brad's carefully cultivated online persona feel suddenly very small and very foolish. The medallion felt impossibly heavy in Brad's hand now, its golden surface no longer gleaming but seeming to pulse with an inner light that only he could see. His livestream viewers watched in confusion as their usually boisterous host fell silent, the color draining from his face as he stood transfixed by the guard's unwavering stare. In the tense silence that followed, the only sound was the soft tinkling of the medallion's broken clasp as Brad's hand began to tremble. The ancient gardens of Kyoto, which had witnessed countless ceremonies and celebrations over the centuries, were about to observe something else entirely. The moment when modern arrogance collided with immovable tradition, and the consequences that would unfold in the next breathtaking moments. Captain Yamamoto moved with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, each motion precise and purposeful. His first step forward sent gravel crunching beneath his boot, a sound that seemed to echo through the now silent garden like a thunderclap. The movement was so sudden, so controlled, that Brad instinctively took a stumbling step backward, nearly dropping both his phone and the sacred medallion. "Whoa, hey, he actually moves." Brad's attempt at humor fell flat, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to maintain his online persona. The livestream chat exploded with excitement, but the influencer's usual confident smirk had been replaced by an uncertain grimace. His viewer count now approached 70,000, all of them witnessing his bravado crumbling in real time. The guard's second step carried the weight of centuries. His polished boots moved across the ancient stones with measured precision, each footfall deliberate and purposeful. The morning sun caught the remaining metals on his chest, creating an almost ethereal glow around his advancing form. The crowd parted instinctively, like waves before the bow of a mighty ship. "Listen, man, it was just a joke for the stream," Brad stammered, continuing to back away. His designer shoes scuffed awkwardly against the gravel path, his carefully cultivated image of confidence unraveling with each retreating step. The phone in his hand shook slightly, giving his thousands of viewers a jerky view of the unfolding scene. Captain Yamamoto's voice, when it finally came, carried the depth of ancient temples and the authority of countless generations. "The medallion of first light," he spoke in perfect English, each word measured and clear, "has been worn by the Imperial Guard for 5 centuries. It has witnessed the rise and fall of emperors. It has survived wars, natural disasters, and the passage of time itself." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with significance. The garden had become so quiet that the gentle tinkling of the medallion's broken clasp in Brad's trembling hand sounded like temple bells. The surrounding tourists stood transfixed, many still recording but all seemingly holding their breath. A group of Japanese schoolchildren who had been watching the scene unfold whispered among themselves in awe, having never heard one of the legendary guards speak before. "Each guard who wears this medallion," Captain Yamamoto continued, taking another measured step forward, "takes a sacred oath. We swear to protect not just the physical symbol, but the very essence of respect it represents. His eyes remained locked on Brad's, unwavering and intense. The social media star's attempts to maintain eye contact failed, his gaze dropping to the ground like a scolded child. The live stream chat had evolved from excitement to concern, with many viewers now urging Brad to return the medallion and apologize. Others demanded he stand his ground, creating a digital chorus of conflicting advice that only seemed to increase his visible discomfort. Beads of sweat ran down his face, cutting through his carefully applied self-tanner. "Look, I'll just put it back, okay?" Brad's voice had lost all trace of its former bravado. He extended his hand tentatively, the medallion catching the light one more time, but Captain Yamamoto made no move to take it. Instead, he took one final step forward, closing the distance between them to arm's length. The tension in the garden had reached a fever pitch. The morning breeze had died completely, leaving the air thick with anticipation. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent, as if nature itself was waiting to see how this clash between old and new would resolve. The security camera continued its silent vigil, its lens capturing every moment of this unprecedented confrontation. "In your hand," the guard spoke again, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed garden. "You hold not just metal and gold, but the embodiment of a nation's dignity. Your actions today have not merely broken a clasp, they have challenged the very foundations of respect that this place represents." Brad's livestream viewers watched as their usually confident host seemed to physically shrink under the weight of these words. His expensive tank top, with its garish, Party Beast logo, suddenly looked childish and out of place against the backdrop of ancient stone and ceremony. The medallion in his hand appeared to grow heavier with each passing second. Far behind the crowd, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, multiple sets moving with purpose across the gravel paths. But before anyone could reach the scene, Captain Yamamoto was about to demonstrate that some lessons in respect don't require words or force, only the unwavering dignity that comes from centuries of tradition. The approaching footsteps revealed themselves as Chief Inspector Hiroshi Tanaka emerged from behind the ancient cherry trees, flanked by two junior officers. At 60 years old, the inspector cut an imposing figure in his immaculate black uniform, his silver-streaked hair and stern expression speaking to decades of protecting the palace's honored traditions. His arrival sent a fresh wave of whispers through the crowd, as those familiar with palace protocol recognized the significance of his presence. The polished badge on his chest caught the morning light, its surface marked with the imperial chrysanthemum, a symbol of authority almost as sacred as the medallion Brad still clutched in his trembling hand. "Your live stream has reached the palace's security office, Mr. Thompson." The inspector spoke in crisp, accented English, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that seemed to permeate everything in the ancient garden. "We've been watching your performance for the past 10 minutes. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, the morning sun reflecting off them momentarily like camera flashes. His right hand rested casually on the ceremonial sword at his hip, a subtle reminder of the bridge between modern law enforcement and ancient tradition. Brad's phone nearly slipped from his sweaty grip as he tried to maintain his composure for his now 80,000 viewers. The number kept climbing as news of the incident spread across social media platforms like wildfire. "Hey, look, I've got rights here. I paid for the tour, and I'm just creating content for my followers." His voice wavered between defiance and uncertainty, the medallion still clutched in his trembling left hand. The expensive smartwatch on his wrist blinked with incoming notifications, each one a digital reminder of the growing storm he had created. Inspector Tanaka raised an eyebrow, the subtle gesture somehow more powerful than any shout could have been. "Rights, Mr. Thompson." He moved forward with measured steps, his polished shoes barely disturbing the gravel. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Let us discuss rights, and more importantly, responsibilities." Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of understanding through the gathered crowd. The assembly had grown larger, drawn by the arrival of palace security. Japanese visitors whispered among themselves, many recognizing the inspector from local news coverage of palace ceremonies. A group of elderly women in traditional kimonos shook their heads in dismay, their expressions reflecting decades of respect for the traditions being violated before them. International tourists continued recording, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in the palace's modern history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden, creating an almost theatrical backdrop to the unfolding drama. "Your social media profile tells us you have 3 million followers," the inspector continued, consulting a tablet one of his officers held. The screen displayed Brad's various social media accounts, his carefully curated online presence laid bare before the authority of tradition. "That's 3 million people you could be teaching about respect, tradition, and cultural understanding." He paused, letting his words sink in. The cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, nature's own commentary on the ephemeral nature of fame versus the permanence of tradition. "Instead, you choose to demonstrate exactly what a visitor to our sacred spaces should never do." Brad's livestream chat had become a tornado of reactions. Some loyal fans still defended him, but they were increasingly drowned out by viewers expressing shock and disappointment at his actions. Hashtags condemning his behavior began trending in multiple countries, the digital world turning against its self-proclaimed beast. The viewer count continued to climb as word of the incident spread across social media platforms, clips of his earlier boasting already being shared and condemned globally. His brand deals and sponsorship logos seemed to mock him from his own clothing, each one representing a contract that might not survive this morning's poor decisions. "The medallion of first light," Inspector Tanaka gestured to the sacred object still in Brad's grip, "has been worn by exactly 1,847 guards since its creation. Each of their names is recorded in our archives, inscribed by hand in scrolls that have survived earthquakes, wars, and the passage of centuries. Each understood its significance." He moved closer, his presence somehow making Brad feel like a small child, despite their similar height. The inspector's eyes held the weight of history itself. Each would have given their life to protect what you treated as a prop for your entertainment. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays filtering through the cherry blossoms to create shifting patterns on the gravel path. These same rays caught the medallion's surface, but instead of its usual proud gleam, it seemed to pulse with an almost accusatory light in Brad's unworthy grasp. The broken clasp continued its soft, rhythmic tinkling, like a tiny bell tolling for the death of his online reputation. "Your actions today, Mr. Thompson," the inspector continued, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "have violated Section 34 of the Imperial Palace Protection Act. This is not merely about disrespect. It is about the deliberate desecration of a national treasure." He nodded to his officers, who moved to flank Brad on either side. Their movements were practiced and precise, like dancers in a carefully choreographed performance that had played out many times before with other visitors who had crossed sacred lines. Brad's trademark confidence had completely evaporated now, replaced by visible panic. Beads of sweat rolled down his temples, smearing the carefully applied self-tanner that had been part of his morning routine just hours ago. Wait. You're not serious about charges, right? I've got brand deals, sponsorships, I can't have legal troubles." His voice cracked, all pretense of the beast persona stripped away to reveal the frightened man beneath. His designer clothes and expensive accessories suddenly seemed like costume pieces in a play that had gone horribly wrong. The inspector's response was cut short by a subtle movement from Captain Yamamoto. The guard, who had remained motionless since his earlier advance, raised his hand in a gesture that immediately commanded everyone's attention. Even Inspector Tanaka paused, showing deference to the ceremonial guardian's unspoken request. The tension in the air crystallized into something almost tangible. The garden fell into an even deeper silence, if that was possible. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves and the continued soft tinkling of the medallion's broken clasp. The next few moments would demonstrate to Brad's ever-growing audience that true authority doesn't need to shout, that real power lies not in social media numbers, but in the quiet dignity of traditions that have survived centuries. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Brad's phone continued to broadcast every moment to his followers, though his hand shook so badly now that the image was barely stable. The costly device that had been his tool for building fame was now broadcasting his downfall to an audience that grew by the thousands with each passing minute. He was about to learn that in the ancient grounds of the Imperial Palace, some lessons come at a price no amount of viral fame can offset. Captain Yamamoto's raised hand hung in the air like a conductor's baton, frozen mid-symphony. The morning light filtering through the cherry blossoms cast intricate shadows across his weathered face as he finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Inspector," he said, never taking his eyes off Brad, "with your permission, I believe this situation requires a traditional resolution." Inspector Tanaka's expression softened almost imperceptibly, understanding flowing between the two men who had dedicated their lives to protecting these sacred grounds. With a slight bow, he stepped back, motioning for his officers to do the same. The crowd shifted anxiously, phones still raised, capturing every moment of this unprecedented scene. Brad's livestream count had now surpassed 100,000 viewers, but the self-proclaimed beast seemed to have forgotten about his audience entirely. His expensive phone trembled in his grip, broadcasting an increasingly unstable image to his worldwide viewers. The medallion in his other hand felt impossibly heavy, as if the weight of all its history was finally making itself known. "There is a ceremony," Captain Yamamoto began, his English clear and measured, "that has been performed only 6 times in the last century. It is called the Restoration of Honor." He took one step forward, his movements so precise that his uniform barely rustled. It was traditionally used when sacred objects were returned to their rightful place after being displaced by war, natural disasters, or... He paused meaningfully. Human error. The garden had fallen so silent that the gentle tinkling of the medallion's broken clasp seemed to echo off the ancient stones. Even the birds appeared to be listening, their morning songs temporarily hushed. A gentle breeze stirred the cherry blossoms, sending a shower of pink petals swirling around the assembled crowd. "The ceremony requires 3 things," the guard continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "First, the acknowledgement of transgression. Second, the willing return of what was taken. And third..." His eyes locked with Brad's, a demonstration of genuine respect. Brad swallowed hard, his carefully cultivated online persona crumbling further with each passing second. His livestream chat exploded with comments, but he couldn't focus on them anymore. The weight of tradition, of real consequences beyond likes and shares, pressed down on him like a physical force. "Your social media empire," Captain Yamamoto gestured to the phone still broadcasting, "reaches millions. You have built your fame on pushing boundaries, on treating the world as your stage." His words carried no judgment, only statement of fact. "But here, in this garden, you stand at a crossroads. Will you continue to broadcast disrespect to your followers, or will you show them something far more powerful, the courage to admit when one has crossed a line?" The morning sun had risen higher, its rays now striking the medallion directly, sending brilliant reflections across the gathered faces. Some of the older Japanese visitors had tears in their eyes, understanding the rarity and significance of what they were witnessing. Young children clutched their parents' hands, instinctively sensing the gravity of the moment. Brad's usually active stream chat had slowed, as if his viewers too were holding their breath. The only sounds were the soft whisper of wind through ancient trees and the continued gentle clicking of the broken clasp, a quiet reminder of actions that couldn't be undone with a simple edit or delete button. "The choice is yours," Captain Yamamoto said, extending his hand palm up. "But know that while social media fame is fleeting, the consequences of this moment will echo through time. Your actions here will be remembered one way or another in the ancient records of this place." Inspector Tanaka watched silently, his hand still resting on his ceremonial sword. His officers remained still, understanding that this moment required not the force of law, but the power of tradition. The security cameras continued their silent vigil, recording every second of what was quickly becoming a viral lesson in respect that would be viewed millions of times in the coming days. Brad Thompson, social media influencer, self-styled digital beast, stood at the intersection of ancient tradition and modern fame. The medallion in his hand continued to catch the light, its surface now seeming to pulse with an inner glow that demanded a decision. His next action would either compound his disgrace or become a powerful message to his millions of followers about respect, tradition, and the courage to admit one's mistakes. The garden held its breath, waiting to see which path he would choose. In this moment, surrounded by the weight of centuries and the eyes of the digital world, Brad was about to learn that sometimes the most viral moments come not from pushing boundaries, but from showing the humility to step back behind them. For what seemed like an eternity, Brad stood frozen, the sacred medallion growing heavier in his trembling hand with each passing second. His usually active mind, so quick to devise viral pranks and attention-grabbing stunts, struggled to process the magnitude of this moment. The morning sun continued its ascent, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of the garden, as if time itself was marking the weight of his decision. His voice cracked and he had to start again. I didn't think. The words felt foreign in his mouth, so different from his usual confident patter. His live stream count had now reached 120,000 viewers, all witnessing this unprecedented moment of vulnerability from their usually brash host. A young Japanese student in the crowd whispered to her friend, the words carrying clearly in the hushed garden, "He's shaking like a maple leaf in autumn." The poetic observation sparked a ripple of murmurs through the assembled observers, phones still raised to capture every moment of this unfolding drama. Captain Yamamoto remained perfectly still, his extended hand unwavering. The morning breeze rustled his ceremonial uniform, causing the remaining medals on his chest to catch the light. "Tradition teaches us," he spoke softly, his words carrying to every corner of the silent garden, "that true strength lies not in taking, but in knowing when to give back." Brad's designer watch buzzed continuously with notifications as clips of his transgression began going viral across multiple platforms. His carefully curated online persona was unraveling in real time, but for perhaps the first time in his digital career, he wasn't thinking about the views or engagement metrics. "The ceremony," Captain Yamamoto continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, "requires a bow of exactly 45 degrees. This angle represents the meeting point between pride and humility, between the individual and the collective." His eyes remained fixed on Brad, carrying centuries of unwavering tradition in their steady gaze. Inspector Tanaka and his officers maintained their respectful distance, understanding that this moment required not the force of law, but the power of tradition to reach its proper resolution. The security cameras continued their silent vigil, their lenses capturing every nuance of this encounter between modern influence and ancient dignity. Brad's phone suddenly slipped from his sweaty grip, clattering onto the gravel path. The sound echoed through the garden like a gunshot, causing several visitors to gasp. But instead of diving to rescue his expensive device, Brad remained focused on the medallion in his other hand. For the first time, he truly looked at it, not as a prop for his content, but as the sacred object it was. The intricate engravings on its surface told stories of honor and duty, each scratch and mark a testament to the generations of guards who had worn it with pride. The morning light caught these ancient marks, making them seem to dance and shift before his eyes. In that moment, something changed in Brad Thompson's expression, a shift so subtle yet so profound that his viewers would later replay this moment thousands of times, trying to capture exactly when the transformation occurred. "My followers," Brad spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, "always watch me break rules. They expect it. He paused, swallowing hard. "They celebrate it." His eyes remained fixed on the medallion, its surface now blurred by what might have been tears. But maybe just this once they need to see something different. A cherry blossom petal drifted down, landing softly on the medallion's surface. The delicate pink against the ancient gold created an image so striking that several tourists instinctively captured it with their cameras. The gentle tinkling of the broken clasp had finally stopped, as if even this small sound was holding its breath for what would come next. Brad's livestream chat, which had been a constant tornado of reactions, suddenly slowed as viewers sensed the gravity of the moment. The usual spam of emojis and memes gave way to a different kind of message. Do the right thing, beast. Show us what respect looks like. Make us proud for once. With hands that had finally stopped shaking, Brad Thompson, the self-proclaimed digital beast with 3 million followers, took a deep breath. His next actions would either compound his disgrace or transform this moment of shame into something his followers had never seen before, a lesson in humility that no amount of viral stunts could match. The garden waited in perfect silence, the ancient stones and timeless trees bearing witness to this collision of worlds, where social media fame met ageless tradition, and where the next 60 seconds would determine whether digital influence could bow to real respect. With a fluidity that surprised even himself, Brad slowly lowered into a bow. Not the casual nod he'd given to countless fans, but a proper Japanese bow, back straight, head lowered, precisely 45 degrees just as the ceremony demanded. His designer clothes, meant to showcase his influencer status, now seemed to adapt to this moment of humility, the expensive fabric rustling softly in the morning breeze. I, Brad Thompson, he spoke, his voice carrying a tremor but growing stronger with each word. Apologize for my disrespect to this sacred place, its traditions, and its guardians. The words came not from his usual script of viral catchphrases, but from somewhere deeper, more genuine. His followers watched in stunned silence as their digital hero transformed before their eyes. Captain Yamamoto's expression remained unchanged, but those closest to him might have noticed a subtle softening around his eyes. The words have been spoken, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. Now comes the return. The morning sun seemed to intensify at that moment, bathing the scene in golden light as if nature itself was participating in the ceremony. With hands that had finally stopped shaking, Brad carefully lifted the medallion. For the first time, he held it not as a prop for his content, but as the sacred object it was. The intricate engravings caught the light, each mark and symbol telling stories of honor that had survived emperors and wars, natural disasters, and the relentless march of time itself. In returning this medallion, Captain Yamamoto instructed, his words measured and clear, "You must recite the ancient phrase of restoration." He spoke the Japanese words slowly, allowing Brad to hear each syllable. The phrase, passed down through generations of guards, had never before been taught to an outsider. The crowd watched in absolute silence as modern influence prepared to speak ancient wisdom. Brad listened intently, his usual impatience replaced by careful attention. His livestream viewers, now numbering over 150,000, watched as he practiced the phrase under his breath, determined not to disrespect the tradition further by mispronouncing the sacred words. A young Japanese student in the crowd nodded approvingly at his careful effort. The broken clasp tinkled one final time as Brad raised the medallion with both hands, holding it at eye level as tradition demanded. The morning light caught its surface, creating a halo effect that countless phones captured, but none could quite do justice to. In that moment, the garden seemed to hold its breath, ancient stones and cherry blossoms alike waiting to witness this unprecedented ceremony. Meiyoto soncho no tame ni, watashi wa kore o modoshimasu. Brad spoke carefully. Each syllable carried clear and true across the hushed garden. For honor and respect, I return this. His pronunciation, while not perfect, carried a sincerity that transcended any linguistic shortcomings. His followers watched in amazement as their usually boisterous host spoke ancient words with quiet reverence. Captain Yamamoto stepped forward, his movements as fluid as water, as precise as calligraphy. His hands met Brad's, and for a moment, they both held the medallion. The morning sun caught this moment of connection between old and new, tradition and modernity, creating an image that would be shared millions of times in the coming days. The return is accepted, the guard announced, his voice carrying notes of both authority and acknowledgement. With practiced care, he began the process of reattaching the medallion to his uniform. Each movement was deliberate, part of a ritual that had been performed countless times over centuries. The broken clasp would be repaired later in another ceremony, but for now, the medallion's return to its rightful place carried its own powerful significance. Brad remained in his bow, awaiting permission to rise as protocol demanded. His livestream chat, usually a chaos of emojis and memes, had transformed into a stream of respectful comments. "Never been prouder to be a Beast Army member," one viewer wrote. "This is what real content looks like," added another. The digital world, so often criticized for its superficiality, was bearing witness to a moment of genuine transformation. Inspector Tanaka watched from his position, a subtle smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His hand had left his ceremonial sword, the threat of legal consequences replaced by the power of tradition to teach its own lasting lessons. His officers maintained their respectful distance, understanding that they were witnessing something far more powerful than any official enforcement could achieve. The garden itself seemed to approve of this resolution. A fresh breeze stirred the cherry blossoms, sending a shower of pink petals swirling around the assembled crowd. The ancient stones reflected the strengthening morning light, creating an atmosphere that felt both timeless and immediately present. The security cameras continued their silent witness, capturing every moment of this unprecedented meeting between social media influence and ancient tradition. Brad's phone lay forgotten on the gravel path, still broadcasting but no longer the center of his attention. In this moment, the self-proclaimed digital beast was learning that some things carry more weight than viral fame, that real influence sometimes comes not from pushing boundaries, but from respecting them. "Rise," Captain Yamamoto's voice carried across the garden, granting permission for Brad to straighten from his bow. As the influencer rose, those closest to him noticed something had changed. The brash confidence that had dominated his demeanor earlier was gone, replaced by something more measured, more authentic. His party beast tank top seemed to hang differently on his shoulders now, as if the weight of tradition had permanently altered his bearing. Inspector Tanaka stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "Mr. Thompson," he spoke, his tone carrying a new note of respect. "The palace recognizes your participation in the ceremony of restoration. While your initial actions were regrettable, your choice to honor our traditions has been noted." He gestured to one of his officers, who produced an official-looking document. "This certificate," the inspector continued, "marks your participation in a ceremony that has been performed only 7 times in the past century. You are now part of our palace's historical record." The paper, with its imperial seal and traditional calligraphy, seemed to glow in the strengthening morning light. Brad accepted it with both hands, as he had seen others do with important documents, his movements now naturally more respectful. His live stream continued to broadcast from the phone on the ground, its camera angle capturing the scene from below and creating an almost cinematic quality. His viewer count had swelled to over 200,000, with clips of the ceremony already spreading across multiple platforms. But for once, viral fame wasn't at the forefront of Brad Thompson's mind. "I know my followers probably expected something different today," Brad spoke, his voice carrying none of its usual performative energy. "They tuned in to watch the beast push boundaries and break rules." He looked down at the certificate in his hands, then back at the guard whose medallion he had so carelessly violated. "Instead, they saw me learn something I should have known all along, that some boundaries exist for a reason and some rules protect things worth preserving." The crowd's response was immediate and genuine. Applause broke out, not the raucous cheering his stunts usually generated, but something more dignified, more appreciative. Japanese visitors nodded in approval, while international tourists lowered their phones, choosing to experience this moment directly rather than through their screens. Captain Yamamoto stepped forward once more, the restored medallion gleaming on his chest. "In our tradition," he spoke, his words measured and clear, "we believe that true strength shows itself not in moments of defiance, but in moments of understanding. Today you have demonstrated both kinds of strength to your followers." The guard's words carried no judgment, only acknowledgement of a transformation witnessed. Brad's phone continued to capture reactions from his global audience. The chat, usually filled with demands for more outrageous behavior, now flowed with messages of respect and appreciation. "This is what growth looks like," one viewer commented. "Best Beast Army content ever," wrote another. The digital world, so often criticized for its superficiality, was bearing witness to a moment of genuine change. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays filtering through the cherry blossoms to create dappled patterns on the ancient stones. The garden's atmosphere had transformed from one of tension to one of peaceful resolution. Even the birds had returned, their songs adding a natural harmony to the moment. "Before you leave," Inspector Tanaka said, consulting his tablet, "there is one final matter to address." Brad tensed slightly, perhaps expecting legal consequences, but the inspector's next words surprised him. "Our Cultural Education Department would like to discuss the possibility of collaborating on content that properly showcases our traditions to your young followers. Your experience today could serve as a powerful teaching moment." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. The very platform Brad had intended to use for disruption could now become a tool for promoting cultural understanding and respect. His followers, who had tuned in expecting another boundary-pushing stunt, had instead witnessed a masterclass in humility and growth. A young Japanese student approached Brad, holding out his phone that had fallen earlier. She bowed slightly as she returned it, and without thinking, Brad returned the gesture with proper form. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras, a perfect symbol of his transformation. His live stream chat exploded with positive reactions, his followers celebrating this new, more respectful version of their digital idol. As the crowd began to disperse, Brad took one final look at Captain Yamamoto, who had returned to his post with the same dignity he had maintained throughout the entire incident. The medallion caught the light one last time, but now instead of seeing it as a prop for content, Brad saw it for what it truly was: a symbol of traditions worth respecting, boundaries worth honoring, and lessons worth learning. The morning's events would soon become viral content, but not in the way Brad had originally planned. Instead of adding another prank to his collection, he had unknowingly created something far more valuable: a moment of genuine growth that would resonate far beyond the ancient walls of the Imperial Palace. Within hours of Brad Thompson's live stream ending, the incident at the Imperial Palace had taken on a life of its own across the digital landscape. Clips of the ceremony spread across multiple platforms, each one telling a different part of the story. The transformation of the self-proclaimed party beast into a humble student of tradition resonated with audiences in unexpected ways, sparking conversations about respect, cultural sensitivity, and the responsibility that comes with influence. News organizations around the world picked up the story, their headlines reflecting the unusual nature of the event. Social media star's prank turns into powerful lesson in respect. Ancient ceremony transforms modern influencer. Digital meets traditional, a viral moment of true change. The footage of Brad's sincere bow and careful pronunciation of the traditional phrase was played countless times, each viewing carrying the message further. Back in his hotel room, Brad sat quietly reviewing the comments flooding his various social media accounts. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the incident, but the notifications were different now. Instead of the usual mix of pranks, suggestions, and calls for more outrageous content, his followers were sharing their own stories of learning respect and cultural understanding. "Your video made me apologize to my Japanese grandmother for never learning her traditions," one comment read. "I canceled my plan to make prank videos at sacred sites," wrote another. "This is the kind of influence we need to see more of," a third declared. The engagement metrics were higher than anything Brad had ever achieved with his stunts, but for the first time, numbers weren't his primary concern. The certificate from the Imperial Palace lay carefully preserved on his desk, its official seal catching the afternoon light. Next to it sat a formal invitation from the palace's cultural department to participate in a series of educational videos about Japanese traditions and proper tourist etiquette. The irony wasn't lost on Brad. His attempt to disrupt tradition had somehow turned him into its unexpected ambassador. Several major brands that had been considering dropping him after the initial video of his disrespect went viral now reached out with different proposals. They wanted to partner on campaigns about cultural awareness, responsible tourism, and digital citizenship. His manager's inbox was flooded with requests for speaking engagements at schools and youth organizations, all wanting to hear about the moment that changed everything. Meanwhile, at the Imperial Palace, Captain Yamamoto's day continued as it had for the past 20 years. He stood at his post, the restored medallion gleaming on his chest, its recently repaired clasp stronger than before. Visitors who recognized him from the viral videos bowed more deeply now, some stopping to thank him for teaching a lesson that transcended cultural boundaries. The palace gift shop, responding to numerous requests, began offering respectful educational materials about the ceremony of restoration. The proceeds would go toward cultural preservation efforts, turning one moment of potential disrespect into a lasting contribution to tradition. Young visitors could often be heard practicing the ceremonial phrase Brad had spoken, their careful pronunciation reflecting a new generation's appreciation for ancient customs. In Los Angeles, Brad's content underwent a dramatic transformation. His channel, once dedicated to pushing boundaries and breaking rules, now featured thoughtful explorations of different cultures and traditions. The Beast Army evolved from a crowd of prank enthusiasts into a community dedicated to promoting respect and understanding. His follower count actually grew, proving that substance could be just as engaging as spectacle. The incident became a case study in digital media courses, analyzing how a potential public relations disaster transformed into a moment of genuine growth and positive influence. Marketing experts pointed to it as an example of how authenticity and humility could resonate more powerfully than carefully crafted controversy. 3 months after the ceremony, Brad received an unexpected package from Japan. Inside was a small replica of the Medallion of First Light, not a toy or souvenir, but a carefully crafted piece approved by the palace itself. The accompanying note from Inspector Tanaka read, "To remind you that some boundaries protect things worth preserving, and some lessons are worth sharing." The replica now hung in Brad's studio, visible in all his videos. His followers often commented on how he touched it respectfully before starting each stream, a small gesture that served as a constant reminder of that transformative morning in Kyoto. His old, party beast tank top had been retired, replaced by more thoughtful attire that reflected his evolved persona. As social media continued its rapid evolution, the incident at the Imperial Palace became a reference point for discussions about digital responsibility and cultural respect. Other influencers, seeing the positive impact of Brad's transformation, began approaching their content with more consideration for traditions and boundaries. The morning's events had created something no one could have predicted, a bridge between the ancient and the modern, the traditional and the digital, proving that even in an age of viral content and instant fame, some lessons are timeless and some transformations are genuine. 1 year after the incident at the Imperial Palace, Brad Thompson stood once again in the East Garden, though under very different circumstances. This time, he was there by official invitation, wearing a respectful dark suit instead of his former attention-grabbing attire. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, just as they had been on that transformative morning, their petals dancing on the spring breeze like nature's own celebration. He was there to participate in the palace's annual cultural preservation ceremony, having been asked to share his story with a new generation of visitors and social media influencers. The irony of his role as a speaker on respectful tourism and digital responsibility wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Brad himself. His viral moment of transformation had become a powerful teaching tool, used in cultural sensitivity training programs around the world. Captain Yamamoto was there too, standing at his post with the same unwavering dignity. The Medallion of First Light gleamed on his chest, its restored clasp now bearing a small, almost imperceptible marking, a reminder of the day when disrespect had transformed into understanding. The guard's expression remained as stoic as ever, but those who knew him well might have noticed a subtle nod of acknowledgement as Brad passed by. "A year ago I stood in this very spot," Brad began his address to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying none of its former brash enthusiasm, but rather a measured respect that had become his new trademark. "I was a different person then, someone who thought tradition was just another boundary to push, another rule to break for views and likes. The audience, a mix of traditional media, fellow influencers, and cultural preservation advocates, listened intently. His presentation included clips from that fateful morning, but they were shown not for entertainment or shock value. Instead, they served as powerful illustrations of how quickly disrespect could turn into learning, how ancient traditions could teach modern lessons. The ceremony he had undergone, once private and sacred, had become a symbol of cultural bridge building in the digital age. The Beast Army, as my followers were known, has evolved, Brad explained, gesturing to the engagement metrics displayed behind him. We've grown from 3 million subscribers who watched for pranks to 5 million who engage with content about cultural understanding and responsible tourism. The numbers told a compelling story. His most viewed videos were no longer about breaking rules, but about understanding why they existed. Inspector Tanaka, now promoted to Chief of Palace Security, watched from the sidelines with quiet satisfaction. The cultural education program he had proposed in the aftermath of the incident had exceeded all expectations. Collaborations between the palace and various social media influencers had led to a marked decrease in disrespectful behavior among young visitors, proving that traditional wisdom could indeed be transmitted through modern channels. The replica medallion still hung in Brad's studio, but it had gained companions, respectful gifts from other cultural institutions he had visited and learned from over the past year. His content creation had evolved into a form of cultural diplomacy, building bridges between different traditions and their modern audiences. The party beast persona had been retired, replaced by something more meaningful and, surprisingly, more successful. What I learned that morning wasn't just about one medallion or one ceremony, Brad continued, his words carried across the garden by a gentle microphone, so different from his previous shouting. It was about understanding that true influence comes not from disrupting traditions, but from helping others understand their value. The cherry blossoms continued their gentle descent, nature providing a perfect backdrop to his message. His original live stream of the incident, which had captured both his transgression and transformation, had become required viewing in several university courses on digital ethics and cultural sensitivity. Marketing students analyzed how authentic growth could resonate more powerfully than manufactured controversy. Cultural anthropologists studied it as an example of traditional ceremonies adapting to modern contexts without losing their essential dignity. The Palace gift shop had maintained its educational display about the ceremony of restoration, with proceeds continuing to support cultural preservation efforts. Young visitors could often be heard practicing the ceremonial phrase, just as Brad had done a year ago, but now with preemptive respect, rather than after a transgression. His moment of learning had created ripples that continued to influence others. Brad's partnership with the palace's cultural department had expanded beyond Japan. He now worked with traditional institutions worldwide, helping them navigate the complex intersection of ancient customs and modern media. His followers had become unofficial ambassadors for respectful tourism, often sharing their own stories of learning and growth. As he concluded his address, Brad bowed to the audience, a proper 45-degree bow, just as he had learned during the ceremony. The gesture was no longer just a formal protocol, but a genuine expression of respect. The morning sun caught the real medallion of first light on Captain Yamamoto's chest and the replica hanging from Brad's lapel, creating twin gleams that seemed to symbolize the bridging of past and present. The impact of that transformative morning at the Imperial Palace had rippled far beyond Japan's borders, creating waves of change across the global social media landscape. Digital influencers worldwide had begun approaching cultural sites with newfound respect, many citing the Brad Thompson incident as a turning point in their content creation philosophy. What had started as a potential act of disrespect had evolved into a worldwide movement for mindful social media influence. Major social platforms had taken notice, implementing new guidelines for content created at cultural and historical sites. The Respect First initiative, inspired by Brad's transformation, now provided creators with cultural sensitivity resources before they could monetize content filmed at sacred locations. The medallion incident had become a case study in responsible influence, taught in digital marketing courses from Los Angeles to London. Brad's original live stream, which had captured both his transgression and redemption, had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. But unlike typical viral videos that faded into digital obscurity, this one had gained meaning with each sharing. Cultural institutions worldwide had incorporated it into their visitor orientation programs, using it to demonstrate how ancient traditions could command respect even in the age of instant content. The thing about viral moments, Brad explained during a TED Talk that had itself garnered millions of views, is that they usually showcase the extremes of human behavior, the shocking, the outrageous, the controversial. But sometimes they can capture something more profound, the moment when someone learns to see the world differently. The audience, a mix of traditional media veterans and digital innovators, nodded in understanding. The Beast Army community had undergone its own evolution, transforming from a fan base that celebrated boundary-pushing pranks into a global network of cultural appreciation. Members now shared their own stories of respectful tourism, creating a ripple effect of positive influence. What had once been a source of digital disruption had become a force for cultural preservation and understanding. Educational institutions had taken notice as well. Universities began offering courses examining the intersection of social media, influence, and cultural responsibility, often using the medallion incident as a central case study. Students analyzed how a potential PR disaster had transformed into a moment of genuine growth and positive change, proving that authenticity could be more powerful than calculated controversy. Captain Yamamoto's role had evolved too, though he would never seek recognition for it. The guard had become a silent symbol of unwavering tradition in a changing world, his image appearing in textbooks and cultural preservation materials worldwide. The medallion of first light, with its restored clasp, had become more than just a ceremonial symbol. It was now a globally recognized emblem of respect transcending cultural boundaries. Tourism patterns at the Imperial Palace had shifted noticeably. Visitors, particularly young social media users, approached the guards with measured respect rather than seeing them as photo opportunities. Many practiced the ceremonial phrase Brad had learned, not out of obligation but from a genuine desire to show respect for the traditions they were encountering. The Palace gift shop's educational materials about the ceremony of restoration had been translated into 12 languages, with proceeds supporting cultural preservation efforts worldwide. Young visitors from different countries could be heard practicing the ceremonial phrases in their own accents, creating a multicultural chorus of respect that echoed through the ancient gardens. Brad's content creation company had transformed entirely, moving away from shock value entertainment to focus on cultural appreciation and responsible tourism. His production team now included cultural consultants and local historians, ensuring that every piece of content served not just to entertain, but to educate and inspire respect. The replica medallion in Brad's studio had become a sort of pilgrimage site for other influencers seeking to reform their content strategy. They would touch it respectfully before filming, a gesture that had become a recognized symbol of commitment to responsible influence. The party beast persona had been completely retired, replaced by something more meaningful and, surprisingly, more influential. International brands had taken notice of this shift, leading to a change in how they approached influencer partnerships. Rather than seeking out controversial figures for quick attention, many now prioritized creators who demonstrated cultural awareness and responsibility. Brad's transformation had shown that respect could be just as engaging as rebellion, if not more so. The incident had sparked academic research into the role of social media in cultural preservation, with scholars examining how digital platforms could serve as bridges between ancient traditions and modern audiences. The findings suggested that authentic moments of learning and growth resonated more deeply with younger audiences than carefully crafted marketing campaigns. The morning's events had created something unprecedented, a template for how modern media could interact with ancient traditions in a way that preserved dignity while promoting understanding. It proved that even in an age of instant content and viral fame, some lessons were timeless, and some transformations were genuine. 5 years after the incident at the Imperial Palace, Brad Thompson returned once again to Kyoto, this time accompanied by a film crew from a major documentary channel. They were creating a special feature titled Digital Age Traditions, when viral moments meet timeless respect. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, just as they had been on that transformative morning, creating a perfect symbolic circle in Brad's journey. The East Garden looked exactly as it had that fateful day, its ancient stones and carefully maintained paths a testament to the enduring nature of tradition. A new generation of tourists moved respectfully through the space, many of them wearing small medallion pins, a symbol of commitment to responsible tourism that had become globally recognized after Brad's incident. Captain Yamamoto had since retired, but his legacy lived on through the new guards who maintained the same unwavering dignity. The medallion of first light, now worn by his successor, still caught the morning sun with the same brilliant gleam. The small mark on its restored clasp remained, preserved as a reminder that even moments of disrespect could lead to profound change when met with dignity, rather than anger. "It's strange," Brad spoke to the documentary crew, his voice carrying the weight of experience rather than the brash confidence of his former self. "I came here thinking I would create a viral moment, but instead the moment created me." He stood at the exact spot where he had once grabbed the medallion, now marked with a small, dignified plaque that served as both a warning and an inspiration to visitors. The documentary team interviewed various figures connected to the incident. Inspector Tanaka, now an international consultant on cultural preservation in the digital age, spoke about how one moment of potential crisis had transformed into a global movement for respectful tourism. Palace staff shared stories of how visitor behavior had changed, with young tourists now often bowing respectfully before taking photos. Brad's former Beast Army had evolved into something unprecedented in social media culture. The community, now known as Global Guardians, had chapters in over 50 countries. Members dedicated themselves to promoting respectful cultural exchange and responsible content creation. What had started as a fan base for pranks had become a worldwide network of cultural ambassadors. Universities worldwide now offered courses examining what they called the medallion moment, the intersection of viral fame and cultural respect. Marketing students analyzed how authentic transformation could resonate more powerfully than manufactured controversy. Anthropologists studied how traditional ceremonies could adapt to modern contexts without losing their essential dignity. The original livestream footage had been preserved in cultural archives alongside ancient scrolls and historical documents. Curators recognized it as a pivotal moment in the evolution of digital culture, when the endless pursuit of viral fame first bowed to timeless tradition. The clip had been viewed hundreds of millions of times, each viewing spreading its message of respect and transformation. Brad's career had transformed beyond recognition. The influencer who once chased shock value now hosted a respected series about cultural preservation and responsible tourism. His production company specialized in creating content that bridged the gap between ancient traditions and modern audiences, proving that respect could be just as engaging as rebellion. The ceremony he had undergone that morning had been performed several more times since, though never again for a transgression. Instead, it had evolved into a voluntary ritual for influencers and content creators committed to respectful cultural documentation. Each participant received a small replica medallion, wearing it as a symbol of their commitment to responsible digital citizenship. Social media platforms had permanently changed their policies regarding content created at cultural sites. The Respect First guidelines, inspired by the incident, had become industry standard. Algorithms now favored content that demonstrated cultural awareness and responsibility, proving that digital success and respect for tradition could coexist. The Imperial Palace itself had embraced its role in this modern parable. The gift shop's educational materials about the ceremony of restoration had been translated into 20 languages, with proceeds supporting cultural preservation efforts worldwide. Young visitors practiced the ceremonial phrase, not for social media content, but out of genuine desire to connect with tradition. As Brad concluded his interview for the documentary, the morning sun caught both the actual medallion of first light on the current guard's chest and the replica he wore on his lapel. The twin gleams seemed to symbolize how ancient wisdom and modern media had found a way to coexist, each enriching the other without compromising its essential nature. The garden's ancient stones had witnessed countless ceremonies over the centuries, but perhaps none as significant for the modern age as that morning 5 years ago. It proved that even in an era of instant content and viral fame, some lessons were timeless, some transformations genuine, and some traditions powerful enough to change not just one person, but an entire digital generation. As the documentary crew packed up their equipment in the Imperial Palace garden, Brad Thompson stayed behind for one final moment of reflection. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones, reminiscent of that transformative morning when a social media stunt had evolved into something far more meaningful. He stood quietly, watching a new generation of visitors move respectfully through the space he had once treated so carelessly. A group of young influencers approached the current guard, phones lowered, and bowed properly before asking permission to take photos. Their respectful behavior was no longer unusual. It had become the norm, thanks in part to the ripple effects of what historians now called the medallion moment. The guard acknowledged them with the same dignity that Captain Yamamoto had shown years ago, the sacred medallion gleaming on his chest. "Mr. Thompson?" a young voice called out. Brad turned to find a teenage content creator, her phone held respectfully at her side, rather than raised for filming. "Your story was what made me want to become a cultural preservation influencer," she explained, her eyes bright with genuine admiration. "Could you tell me again about the moment you realized everything had changed?" Brad smiled, touching the replica medallion that still hung in its place of honor on his lapel. "It wasn't when I grabbed the medallion, or even when I returned it," he began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It was in that silent moment afterward, when I realized that going viral meant nothing compared to earning real respect." The palace archives now contained a special exhibition dedicated to the incident and its aftermath. Visitors could view the original medallion clasp, carefully preserved alongside documentation of the ceremony of restoration. The display included a running counter of how many lives had been influenced by that morning's events. Millions of people who had learned to approach tradition with respect rather than seeing it as content fodder. Social media had evolved significantly in the years since that morning. The major platforms now required cultural sensitivity training for verified creators, a policy that had grown directly from the incident's impact. The Global Guardians community, Brad's followers, had become now numbered in the tens of millions, each member committed to promoting respectful cultural exchange. The original livestream footage, now preserved in both digital and physical archives, had become required viewing in universities worldwide. Marketing professors used it to demonstrate how authentic transformation could resonate more powerfully than manufactured controversy. Cultural anthropologists studied it as a pivotal moment when digital culture and ancient tradition found a way to coexist respectfully. Brad's production company had grown into a global leader in responsible content creation, specializing in documentaries that bridged the gap between traditional wisdom and modern audiences. The party beast persona that had once defined his brand was now a distant memory, replaced by something far more meaningful and, surprisingly, more successful. The sun was setting now, casting a golden glow across the garden. A fresh breeze stirred the cherry blossoms, sending petals swirling through the air just as they had on that fateful morning. Brad watched as a new guard took his position, the changing of the guard ceremony executed with the same precision and dignity that had humbled him years ago. "The thing about tradition," Brad explained to the young influencer who still stood beside him, "is that it doesn't need to go viral to be valuable. It's been surviving and teaching lessons for centuries before social media, and it will continue long after our last posts have been forgotten." He gestured to the guard standing at attention, the medallion of first light catching the day's final rays. "Our job isn't to change tradition for our audiences, but to help our audiences understand why tradition matters." As darkness began to fall over the Imperial Palace grounds, the garden lights came on, casting a gentle glow over the ancient stones. Brad prepared to leave, but not before making one final respectful bow toward the guard's post. The gesture was no longer just a formal protocol. It had become as natural to him as breathing, a physical reminder of the lessons he had learned that morning years ago. The security cameras that had captured his transgression still maintained their silent vigil, but now they recorded countless moments of respect rather than disrespect. The garden paths that had once been stages for tourist spectacles had become spaces of quiet appreciation and learning. Even the gift shop's replica medallions served not as mere souvenirs, but as symbols of commitment to cultural understanding. As Brad finally turned to leave, he caught one last glimpse of the actual medallion of first light, its surface still gleaming with the same timeless dignity that had transformed him years ago. In that moment, he understood that some lessons never truly end. They simply continue to teach new generations in new ways, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding, one respectful bow at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.